a kind of a combination, a synergy between the ruling class and the ruled class on how they can negotiate to bring this kind of transformation. And of course, at the end of the day, what people want is the freedom to have to choose their work, the freedom to have the property they amass during their economic lifetime, and of course, entrepreneurship rights to be able to produce, to be able to participate in the market, and to be able to innovate. Within the African context now, we see a lot of startups coming, especially in South Africa, Nigeria, Senegal, and other countries. But these startups are not supported by the law. When I say the law, it's also the function, the activity of the law that's very important. Are the banks, for example, allowed to lend money to startups? Or do startups have to go outside Africa to get finance to be able to do what they're doing here? Some of them have become unicorns, going over $1 billion in terms of their capital. But the point is, local banking facilities in Africa have become prime lenders of the government because they buy treasury bills, they get good interests out of this, and they become literally a second central bank for the government, rather than banks that are going to provide entrepreneurs with the resource to be able to grow and flourish. And I think there is this hidden motive that most people have written about, is that an educated population, an active population, and a politically sensitive civil society would be dangerous for the incumbent, and therefore suppressing education and other forms of human development initiatives might be a kind of an agenda for incumbents in Africa. And therefore, it is people themselves using social media, the broader media, educational facilities, and civil society activists who would eventually bring in people to say no to certain kinds of legal regimes, to say no to corruption, for example. And whenever we hear about corruption in Africa, it's high-level corruption that never gets anywhere. Nothing has been taken to court, except on the other side.
I like the argument of corruption, no? In that since we are talking about law, of course, it is very relevant, the topic on corruption. And since we are beginning to see now, because from where we are looking at the argument, it appears that there is somebody that is sort of favoring this situation that is happening in Africa, almost like a kind of a shadow government, no? Some people are somewhere are just benefiting from what is happening in Africa, irrespective of the people that are dying. Those who they don't care about it. Because if we talk of empowering the people, who is it going to favor? If we talk of educating the African masses, who is it going to favor? Maybe let's try to understand it from that point of view also. Because are we saying that these few leaders, because there are very few actually in Africa that are in charge of African powers, and they have remained these same people, whether in the military or in politics. For example, in Nigeria, no, we would usually say that the people that were in charge of the Nigerian government, they were mainly military, but they left, they changed their uniform, and they become civilian. They are the same people that we are still voting into office. Nothing have happened. They haven't gone anywhere. You know, the question, what I'm trying to say is that, is it that these people are just wicked, or because they are trying to respect order that is coming from above? I'm not able to understand it. Is it out of wickedness on their part that they refuse to develop their people? For example, they refuse to develop light in Nigeria. They just refuse to do it, not because they cannot do it. Is it out of wickedness on the part of the few leaders in Africa, or because they are responding to a higher power overseas?
Well, you see, the problem is the genesis of leadership in Africa. You know, some of our post-colonial leaders actually were also members of parliament of colonial powers. They were in parliament in colonial powers. They were even ministers of colonial powers in France. And then, of course, we had very successful, almost 110 military coups and counter coups that decimated the first crop of African leaders after independence. And then, of course, in 1991, there was a movement towards wider elections within Africa. And elections were seen as an end of them in themselves. They were not, elections are a very important part of democracy, but they are not the entire democracy. And therefore, what the West tried to impose using its own multilateral institutions that are providing funding for African governments is that elections became the center point of everything that democracy is. The issue of educating the public, the issue of supporting civil society was never there. Agreements are always written between these international financial institutions and bilateral assistance between governments and these institutions, or between governments and governments on the other side. And therefore, the incentive for promoting civil society has been very, very small. And African countries they always revert to this issue of this thin veneer of sovereignty, where they say we're a sovereign nation and they cannot interfere in our sovereign issues. An attempt in 2005 by the United Nations to proclaim the responsibility to protect, when a government is abusing its own population, Security Council would give the right of neighboring states or even the UN peacekeeping to be able to interfere in that. But it has become a rarity rather than a common thing. And therefore, I think the most important thing, as I said earlier, is we have to have a civil society that is well informed, a civil society that has access to the economy, an economic society that is dealing in the economy of the country, not just as a number to calculate the GDP of a nation, but this economic society would entail having young people who are part and parcel of the economy, who are part and parcel of the contribution to the revenue the state is collecting to be able to harass its own people. And therefore, what we see is, if you want to control corruption, for example, everybody gets away with it. You remember the famous Halliburton case in Nigeria, where they were going to build a kind of a liquefied gas plant. On the other side, in the United States, $1.8 billion have been penalized by US courts on the people who have been acting on the US side, with even prison sentence for some CEOs. Because on the African side, nothing has happened. So we need to have a strong civil society. The new strategy of African leaders is to divide and rule society through ethnic lines. And therefore, we have this persistent problem for what you see in Ethiopia here now, what you see in Nigeria between the Hausa, the Igbo, and the Yoruba, what you see in different kinds of countries, Cameroon between the Anglophone and the Francophone, DRC, Rwanda, Burundi, DRC between the Hutus and Tutsis. So what you see, this is a design, a governance design that is permanently fixed in society, so that society would never have harmony that would lead to a common objective on what kind of government they would require. So it's going to take time, but it will happen. It's going to take time. Now, as I said, with social media penetrating much of Africa, and with initiatives from Google and Facebook, where they want to make it available to every African youth, they might have their own business objectives, but definitely the collateral impact would be more young people would have more information in their hands to be able to pressure their governments to transform the kind of governance they have.
Another thing I was just also looking at just now was it's about land. Because when you were explaining before, just in the initial of this podcast, you made mention of the fact that a lot of people have been dispossessed of their land. And of course, we are talking within the framework of the law, because as far as the government is concerned, this is done legally, no? Because in many parts of Africa, lands have been reformed in the sense that they are the property, the land. Even the people are property of the government, so they can do whatever they like, So in terms of compensation, there is actually very little that is given to the people who are being dispossessed of the land. And of course, this has to do also with the resources, no? In that the government be in charge of everything, they decide what happened. And if we were to look at it, let's pretend that we want to take a different lens to look at the case. Say maybe this is a colonial era. It is very obvious, it is very clear that this one was serving the interest of another person. It was for the purpose of administration. Because if I allow you as the owner of the land, it means that those who are running the states, who are running the different government, need to sort of go and negotiate with you. But if the land belongs to them, they can do whatever they like. So, what does the law actually says about the land and the people? If we cannot find any explanation in our current law, then we will go to find out in our traditional law. What does the law says about the land and the people? Who gave the state the right to dispossess the people of the land?
Well, you see, in fact, in the Ethiopian case, we have a unique case where the land belongs to the people, actually, in the constitution. But when you say land belongs to the people, it means it's state ownership. So the state can take your land away anytime, with or without compensation. And in fact, this has led to lots of riots that upset the party about 6 years ago. The expansion of Addis Ababa as a city, where compensation paid to farmers was literally nothing, and also even compensation paid to farmers all over Africa ends up in the hands of the political elite, and nothing goes down to them, even if there is any form of compensation that's being paid by the international organizations funding, like dams, for example. We have the World Bank, the African Development Bank, bilateral assistance, or even investors. So the point is, when you have greed to develop to a level of what you call crony capitalism, then the only way out is for civil society to be able to act on its own government. Nothing can be parachuted from outside to be able to change this. International laws, legal regimes, international humanitarian laws, international human rights laws, all this might help. But definitely what you need is a conscious citizenry that would be forcing governments to change. That would be electing young people that can serve the people and their country and not themselves.